I'll hit broadcast when you tell me, and then I'll let you know when the attendees jump up. So know when to start.
So should I give it like a few seconds to let everyone stroll in before I even start?
Yeah, I think it sort of lets people wait, and then as soon as I hit broadcast, it'll start bringing people in.
All right, excellent. All right, so I'll do that. I'll wait. I'll give it a few seconds to watch people stream in, and then I'll start. You can start letting folks in now.
Okay.
Stand by. Stand by. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome everyone to a Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference production. This is being brought to you by the Council on Communities of Color of CSG East. This is a weekly webinar series on race, racism, and the law. And it's also an extension of this ongoing conversation that we've been having here at CSG East CCC, our ongoing Equity Gap Micro Summit series. Today, we'll be talking with the author of The Color of Law, the award-winning book, tome volume, The Color of Law, Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. We're talking with its author, Richard Rothstein. I'm Charles Ellison, by the way. I'm your moderator and host for this discussion, this one-on-one exclusive interview that we are doing with Mr. Rothstein today. We're still going to give it a moment or two to still allow participants or viewers to settle in the Zoom environment, the virtual environment. We're going to just wait for everyone to take their seats. In the meantime, I'm just going to introduce myself and our distinguished guest for this afternoon. I'm Charles Ellison, moderator and host of this discussion. I'm also moderator and host of the ongoing Equity Gap Micro Summit series that's being presented to you by the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color. As you can see, also the director of that effort, we have Senior Policy Director at CSG East, CCC, Debbie Ann Page. She's joining us here as well. This would not be possible, any of this, without Debbie Ann Page working tirelessly behind the scenes and now in full view, in the flesh. We always appreciate her, appreciate what she's doing. Also appreciate the efforts of CCC Chair, Senator Kevin Parker. Also CCC Co-Chair, Delegate Jocelyn Pina Melnick, who they may both be watching this, Senator Parker from New York and Delegate Pina Melnick from the state of Maryland as well. For more information, go to CSG-ERC.org, CSG-ERC.org, and you can look for the Council on Communities of Color for that entire series that is ongoing. Also, you can join us in the social media environment, #Movement Summit. We have an upcoming day-long movement summit that's going to be happening a little bit later on in September. We're going to be doing some rescheduling around that. Normally, we'd all be meeting in person. I miss you all. Last year, we met in Pittsburgh at CSG East. This year, we are meeting virtually, obviously due to pandemic, but we're still bringing that conversation, these important, essential insights to you, and this is also helping many of you policymakers out there who use these discussions to inform your deliberations around key, crucial issues, particularly issues impacting vulnerable communities, communities of color, Black and brown populations throughout the United States, and particularly in our CSG East coverage area, states like Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, also Connecticut, New Jersey, the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and also provinces in Canada as well, east of the Mississippi. So we do appreciate these conversations. We appreciate you tuning into these conversations, and we'll bring more of them to you. Let's go ahead and get the conversation started. I see we're still getting some people settling in and or finding or looking for any open virtual chairs. We appreciate that. Real quick, rules of engagement. If you have questions or comments, feel free to leave those in two different places. One, you can do that in your Zoom webinar chat. You see the Zoom webinar chat to the right side of the screen. You can leave a question there. You can leave a comment, some sort of insight. You can start doing that now. I'll start fielding those questions and presenting them to our distinguished guest here a little bit later on, but you can start doing that now. Expect in the next 20 or 30 minutes or so for me to do that. Also, you can do that at #MovementSummit on Twitter.com. I am at Ellison Report on Twitter.com. Also #Reality Check. I happen to be the daily host and executive producer of Reality Check on WURD Radio in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. Continue to go to WURDradio.com for more information on Reality Check, your daily dose of public affairs. Now, let's go ahead and get this conversation started. Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. He's also a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, and he's a fellow of the senior fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and also of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. Richard Rothstein joins us today. For more information on him, go to epi.org, I'm told. Richard, how are you doing?
I'm fine.
All right, good. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate this. Lot to talk about and unpack here. In Color of Law, you're making the connection between legal overt segregation then and a lot of the de facto covert subtle segregation that we've seen in recent years and even now. What historical segregation are you finding to be the most worse or the most pronounced, or is it even fair to make that kind of comparison?
Well, the theme of my book, Charles, is that de facto segregation is a myth. It's a rationalization we use to avoid confronting it. De facto segregation is segregation that happened by accident, naturally, either because of private bigotry, landlords or homeowners refusing to sell to African Americans or rent to them, or maybe private businesses like banks and real estate agents refusing to sell to them or rent to them, or maybe people just like to live with each other in the same race, or maybe it's just because of income differences. All of these individual, personal, non-governmental decisions is what we think caused the segregation that we have in every metropolitan area of this country. And it's a very convenient myth, very convenient rationalization, because if it happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. We can think it's too bad, but we don't have feel an obligation to do anything about it. The truth is, the reality is, and this is what the book documents, is that the residential segregation by race in every metropolitan area of this country was explicitly created on a racial basis by federal and state and local policy. Racially explicit policy, not the unintended consequences of benign policies, but racially explicit policy practiced in the mid-20th century by federal, state, and local governments that were so powerful that they determine the racial landscape in every city, every metropolitan area in the country today. Because the segregation that we have was created by government, not the accidental events or personal decisions, because it was created by government. It's a civil rights violation. Segregation, residential segregation, is as much a violation of the Constitution as the segregation of lunch counters or buses or trains that we abolished in the 20th century. If the federal government was enacting policies, explicitly racial policies to create segregation, it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment. Every one of those violations is a civil rights violation, and as American citizens, every one of us has an obligation to support and to press for remedies to civil rights violations. I can go on and talk about what some of those policies are. If you'd like me to do that now.
Please, yeah, let's do that.
I'll give you some, as I told you when we were preparing this this meeting. I could go on for 5 years talking about this, but I'll try to be relatively brief. Perhaps the most powerful of these policies was a policy of the federal government in the mid-20th century to move the entire white working class population out of single-family homes out of urban areas where they were renting apartments into single-family homes in all-white single-family home suburbs. This was done in every metropolitan area of the country. A white noose was created surrounding predominantly Black neighborhoods in urban areas. It was a racially explicit policy, and especially in the East Coast, but all across the country, know these suburbs. You're familiar with them. The most famous of them is probably Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. William Levitt could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes in one place, to buy the land. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to do that. He didn't have any buyers yet. It was a purely speculative venture. We weren't a suburban country at that time. The only people living in suburbs were affluent people. This was a project for returning war veterans, working class families, lower middle class families. The only way that he could build this project was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations in the post-World War II period, submitting his plans for the development, the architectural design, the layout of the streets, the materials he's going to use, and an explicit commitment made to the FHA and the VA that he would never sell a home to an African American. These government agencies even required that he place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was an explicit requirement that was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was written in the federal policy manual of the Federal Housing Administration, a manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend or not recommend for federal bank guarantees, developers' applications. The federal policy manual prohibited the recommendation of guarantees, federal guarantees for bank loans that would be given to developers who might sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods. The manual went so far as to say, and I'm quoting, that you couldn't guarantee a bank loan for a development that would be all white if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because that would, in the words of the manual, run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups.
And that's where you saw sort of the start of different structural types of schemes like redlining. Talk about redlining and like how redlining, where that enters, because we hear that term used quite a bit. That's entered the conversation and debate around segregation. People are talking more and more about housing segregation. Describe redlining for us and when that started.
Well, redlining is a fairly loose term. We generally use it to describe all forms of government segregation, but narrowly considered, the term redlining refers to a policy of a New Deal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. It was set up to really for middle class, again, families. We were not a suburban homeowning country at that time, but the Homeowners Loan Corporation was set up to reinsure mortgages of families in the Depression who were being foreclosed. The Homeowners Loan Corporation drew maps of every metropolitan area in the country and colored red the neighborhoods where it would be too risky for the federal government to guarantee bank loans. And the neighborhoods that were red were neighborhoods where, among a number of characteristics, but primarily where African Americans were living. And as a result, African Americans in urban areas throughout much of the 20th century could not get FHA loans, could not get mortgages in urban areas because they were living in red line neighborhoods. A consequence of that was that they paid much more for their housing than whites were paying for similar housing. In many places, they had to buy homes on contract, on an installment plan, like a layaway plan at a department store. And if they were late with a single payment, they could be evicted with no equity having been appreciated. These were rent-to-own contracts. that's the narrow definition of redlining. It's the refusal of the government to insure loans to mortgages in particular in low-income African-American neighborhoods. But the term is more broadly used to include what I described earlier, and that is the refusal of the federal government to insure bank loans for developers or even to insure mortgages of African-Americans in white neighborhoods, not redline neighborhoods. But the federal government also refused to insure mortgages for African-Americans in green-lined neighborhoods. So both policies were followed.
And also, I should make a note here. We have Debbie-Ann Page. She just left a link in the Zoom webinar chat, Richard, and this is for our listeners and viewers who are tuning into this discussion right now. Really useful and instructive link to a project at, I believe this is at the, this looks like the University of Richmond, Mapping Inequality, Redlining in New Deal America. She's giving a sample here, if you click on that link, of redlining taking place in Staten Island, New York, and the impact that that's sort of having. Just, you see these graphics right here on those populations. Richard, you know, some people listening in on this discussion, or the way you're describing redlining, you're describing how it manifested throughout the years. Some people may say, well, not a whole lot of difference from things we're seeing now, or Black and brown populations, or populations that are concentrated in urban, suburban communities are seeing or experiencing now, correct? But it's just kind of done in a different, lot more subtle, but some might say much more nefarious way.
Well, I'd say that the policies of the mid-20th century were actually more powerful in creating the segregation that we know today than present policies. For example, I mentioned before that in every metropolitan area, white working class families were subsidized by the federal government to move out of urban areas where they were previously living. We were a manufacturing economy at the time. White and Black workers were living in urban areas because all factories and needed to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals. So the white population was moved out. These were very inexpensive homes that they were being moved out to by the federal government. Levittown, the example I used a minute ago. Those homes sold for about $9,000 a piece, $8,000 a piece in the mid-20th century. In today's money, that's $100,000. Well, today, those homes don't sell for $100,000 anymore. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some places, $1 million, $2 million for $100,000 homes. The African Americans who were prohibited from buying those homes did not gain the appreciation, the equity in those homes that accumulated over the next couple of generations. White families bought those homes for $100,000. They're now, they and their children and grandchildren are now sitting in homes worth $500,000 and more. The white families used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies. They used it to finance their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by federal explicit racial policy from participating in this wealth generating exercise. The result is that today, while African American incomes are about 60%, 60% on average of white family incomes, African American wealth is only 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. Well, that wealth gap is the biggest cause of the racial inequality we have today. You're right, there are ongoing policies that have the effect of reinforcing it, but the underlying wealth gap is the main cause. And that wealth gap that prevents African Americans still from moving into communities that have more opportunity, that have access to transportation and jobs and even grocery stores that sell fresh food. That's the wealth gap effect. It creates an achievement gap in schools between Black and white children because we concentrate the most disadvantaged young children in single neighborhoods, single schools where their social and economic disadvantages overwhelm the ability of schools to focus on instruction. The wealth gap that concentrates African Americans in lower income neighborhoods to a much greater extent than whites is a predictor of health disparities between blacks and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease because they live disproportionately in less healthy neighborhoods, more diesel trucks driving through, more pollution, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment. It predicts the mass incarceration crisis and police abuse that we see, which could not happen to nearly the extent that it does if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to good jobs or transportation to get them. And let me make this final comment. I think that the wealth gap, the concentration of African Americans in lower income neighborhoods and even in middle class segregated neighborhoods as a result of this wealth gap, predicts the very, very dangerous and frightening political polarization that we have in this country today. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to understand each other, to empathize with each other, to develop, as I say, the common national identity? Now, there are many policies that we follow today that reinforce this segregation.
Yeah.
But they're not nearly as powerful as the ones that created it initially and that perpetuate it because of the wealth gap that is the consequence of those earlier policies.
I'm curious, you know, so we had the segregation back then, the redlining. I became aware of redlining as a term as a kid growing up in Philadelphia, and my grandmother used to complain about redlining when I used to complain about why we had to go 5, sometimes 10 miles out into another county to find quality groceries or find quality food. So so I had at a very early age and understanding of what that was about or how that was working. And now in cities like Philadelphia, there's a lot more, Washington, D.C. or New York or Chicago, West Coast, Denver, Los Angeles, and other places. There's a lot of conversation about gentrification. And so wanted to get your thoughts on that. We don't hear the use of the word as much. Well, maybe in recent weeks, we started to hear a lot more of it since the president was kind of dog whistling it, segregation. But we've always been talking about, for a while now, a couple of decades, gentrification. How problematic do you find that, that phenomenon of gentrification? And isn't gentrification simply segregation by any other name, if we think a little bit more deeply about it, or how that's manifested?
Well, gentrification, the policies I described before of subsidizing segregated white developments, that was pretty uniform nationwide. Gentrification varies enormously from city to city. There are some places where it's very extreme. Perhaps Oakland, California is the most extreme place. But on the East Coast, New York, Washington, D.C. is taking place. There are many, many other places, though, where gentrification is not a factor, or maybe is exaggerated in people's minds as a factor. Gentrification could be a very, very healthy phenomenon. Every community should be gentrified in the sense that every community should have a mix of affluent, middle class, working class, and low-income housing. That would be a healthy phenomenon. What is happening today, and particularly in the extreme gentrification places that I was talking about, is not healthy gentrification, but uncontrolled gentrification, which simply flips a low-income, particularly minority, African-American, disproportionately community, segregated community, into a high-income, affluent, disproportionately white community. That's not a healthy phenomenon. It just it simply displaces most of the previous residents who were disproportionately Black and Hispanic into newly segregated neighborhoods elsewhere. But we know what the policies are to prevent gentrification from becoming an unhealthy phenomenon. We should be implementing things like rent control, limits on condominium conversions, inclusionary zoning policies that not only require units for low-income families, which is done sometimes now, but workforce housing. You know, in the gentrifying communities that are extreme gentrifiers, like New York or Washington, other places like that, middle-class families, workers, Teachers, nurses, construction workers can't afford any longer to live in the neighborhoods where they have historically. So we need inclusionary zoning that requires sets asides of those kinds of units. And we need property tax freezes for existing residents in neighborhoods that are gentrifying, because in many of these neighborhoods, the homeowners have paid off their homes. They own their own homes. They don't have mortgages on them. They own them free and clear, but they're forced to leave and sell their homes because they can no longer pay the property taxes. So we know what the policies are to resist massive displacement from gentrification. The use of gentrification to flip a low-income segregated community into a high-income segregated white community.
Yeah.
But we're not implementing those policies. The policies aren't hard to figure out. It's the will to do it that's missing.
Yeah, we actually, I want to encourage, once again, I want to also remind folks that you're in our conversation with Richard Rothstein. He's the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, award-winning book. We are in a CSG East, a Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference weekly webinar series that's being presented even more specifically by its Council on Communities of Color. This is a discussion series on race, racism, and the law. I'm Charles Ellison, and we're joined by Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law, also Distinguished Fellow of the Economic Policy Institute. Go to epi.org for more information on them and also him. He's also a fellow of the Thurgood Marshall Institute at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and at the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. Hashtag Movement Summit, or if you have questions and comments right now, I see one or two, you can leave that now if you haven't already in your Zoom webinar chat. I will be looking at those questions. I'm about to ask you one question that I see right now from an audience member, from a participant. You can leave those questions and comments too, feedback on this conversation in the Zoom webinar chat or at hashtag Movement Summit on Twitter. I'll be looking at that very closely too. Richard, we have a question here from one of our attendees. And I'm trying to make out the name. Oh, this is from actually WM Page. Could you talk a little about how the government kept African-American veterans out of neighborhoods after World War II, and if that impact is still being felt today? That's a very timely question because we just reached last week the 75th anniversary of the official end of World War II. And we're having a lot of conversations surrounding what that meant, what that means now. Talk about that, Richard. There was the housing issues and government support, or lack thereof, for Black troops who were coming from World War II, played a very significant role. Then, there's other issues around that are floating around that as well. Like, for example, because you were mentioned like workforce housing, projects actually kind of started off as a positive thing and wasn't built for the people that we typically perceive housing projects being built for. But talk about, address Debbie's question there and how significant the legacy of that is even today, 75 years later.
Well, I guess I wasn't clear earlier when I was describing the policy of the federal government to create these suburbs in the post-World War II period. Mm-hmm. They were created for veterans. Others could live in them as well, but the Veterans Administration was a prime subsidizer of these developments that were created after World War II. I gave the East Coast example of Levittown earlier.
Right.
My uncle was a white returning World War II veteran. He was a working class guy. He managed a produce in the supermarket. He wasn't a high income guy. His family moved to Levittown. African Americans were prohibited. They had jobs similar to his. They could have afforded to live in Levittown. In my book, The Color of Law, I describe an African American family that owned a trucking company. They created a trucking company, and Levitt hired them to deliver sheetrock to Levittown when it was being built, but they were prohibited from living there. And this was true of African Americans generally. The Veterans Administration even subsidized the returning veterans who moved to these suburbs all over the country. I don't want to give the impression that Levittown was some kind of exception.
Right.
The Veterans Administration subsidized them to the extent, whites only, that they required no down payment. They could simply make a monthly mortgage payment, and prior to that, many, many whites were living in public housing and could pay less for their rent, for their monthly mortgage payments in these new suburbs that were created, like Levittown, than they had been paying for rent in public housing beforehand. Public housing. I'm sorry,
so projects, so what we typically know as projects or public housing projects, they started off as transition housing for white middle class populations, or white veterans, people transitioning or trying to make that transformation from being a veteran post-war to the suburbs.
Well, if I may correct that a little bit, it wasn't transition. Some of the white families lived there for long periods of time. They weren't required to leave. They were subsidized to leave into these suburban single-family home developments, all white developments. Public housing in this country began as a program for middle-class, working-class families during the Depression. The first civilian public housing was built by the New Deal, by the Roosevelt administration in 1933. It was always segregated. Separate projects for African Americans, separate projects for whites, frequently creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. We had many integrated neighborhoods in downtown areas at the time in the early 20th, mid-20th century, because, as I said before, we were a manufacturing economy. Most jobs were concentrated near a factory district that had to be located near a deep water port or railroad terminal. But in the Depression, while there were many people who could afford housing, there was no housing being built, so there was a big housing shortage. We had a 25% unemployment rate in the Depression. Public housing was for the 75% who were employed, and it was always segregated. The great African-American novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes, describes in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. This was typical in an integrated neighborhood with an integrated high school. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, integrated neighborhood, and created two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation with that and other projects in Cleveland that persist to this day. In my book, let me just say this one thing. My book, The Color of Law, I like to describe self-satisfied smug places on the East Coast as well as elsewhere that think they're better than every place else. And in the book, I describe Cambridge, Massachusetts. You may have heard of it.
Right.
The area between Harvard and MIT, called the Central Square neighborhood, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. Public Works Administration demolished housing in that integrated neighborhood and built separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, and with other projects elsewhere in the Boston metropolitan area, created, sustained a pattern of segregation that exists to this day in the Boston metropolitan area.
Let me, we have a attendee here, Richard, Vanessa Grossi, who is thanking you for mentioning caps and freezes on property taxes as a possible solution for gentrification. I wonder if I got kind of a question about that too, but she's asking here, what other solutions or ideas do you have for remedying some of the atrocities that came out of housing policies of the past and are still impacting neighborhoods and state residents? So we're kind of expounding on what you were describing earlier. You kind of went through a short list and outline of certain remedies or certain prescriptions. Caps, freezes on property taxes, they're like property tax abatements, because we had some controversy there with property tax abatements in Philly.
Well, let me say something about property tax freezes, if I may, and then I'll get to Vanessa's question specifically about other policies. But, you know, California freezes property taxes for all existing homeowners.
Okay.
So people pay property taxes with an annual adjustment, a small annual adjustment, but they pay property taxes on the assessed value of their home when they purchased it. And then they're not forced out when the neighborhood appreciates, because they're continuing to pay property taxes on the original value, not on the new value. That policy has decimated the financing of public schools and of other public services. Because it's not benefiting from the property taxes that these families would have paid, all families would have paid. that's not a necessary consequence of a property tax freeze. The former commissioner of the IRS, John Koskinen, has made a proposal that we freeze property taxes for existing homeowners, just like California does. But when at the point of sale, those lost property taxes are recouped from the capital gain and returned to the Treasury. So if you have a homeowner in a low income, Oakland, California, for example, which is the worst gentrifying example I can come up with, had a homeowner who bought a home there, an African-American homeowner, bought a home there for $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 15, 20 years ago. And the home is now worth $1 million. And that property owner pays property taxes only on a $40,000 value that he or she originally bought it from. But when they sell the home for $1 million, instead of making a $960,000 capital gain, the property taxes are deducted from that $960,000, and maybe they only make an $800,000 capital gain. So that permits you to freeze property taxes without destroying public services at the same time. Now, let me go into some other, now specifically to Vanessa's question. There are many policies that we can enact. I mentioned some of them before in respect to gentrification, like rent control and like limits on condominium conversions and like inclusionary policies that require units both for low income and for workforce housing. But more aggressively, we should be subsidizing as a constitutional remedy the purchase of homes by African Americans in neighborhoods from which they were unconstitutionally excluded and are now unaffordable to working class families, middle class families of either race, but for which African Americans don't have down payments because they didn't have the opportunity to accumulate that wealth. We should be providing subsidies for those families on I think on a racially explicit basis, an affirmative action program, because it's a remedy for an unconstitutional policy. We also have present policies that reinforce segregation. For example, as you all know, I'm sure, the biggest subsidy we make for low-income families who are disproportionately African-American and Hispanic is the low-income housing tax credit.
Right.
It's a subsidy to nonprofit developers to build housing for low-income families. The Treasury Department that administers this subsidy places a priority on placing low-income housing tax credit units in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. That's crazy. It should be the opposite. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't build any more housing in low-income neighborhoods. We should try to provide better housing in those places. But we certainly should place a priority in placing that housing in high opportunity places. As I say, places with access to good jobs and transportation and, as you said before, grocery stores, supermarkets that sell healthy food.
Right.
The biggest obstacle to doing that is zoning ordinances. That prohibit the construction of townhouses or low-level apartments even, or garden apartments. In my judgment, those zoning ordinances are unconstitutional because even though they don't specifically say they are intended to create racial segregation, they reinforce an unconstitutionally created segregated pattern. And by that measure, they themselves should be deemed unconstitutional. So zoning ordinances that require in communities only single family homes, often on large lot sizes, should be prohibited. That would be another policy we can remedy. As you may know, the Section 8 voucher program also reinforces segregation in a similar way to the low-income housing tax credit because most Section 8 vouchers are usable only in low-income segregated neighborhoods. The amount of the voucher is targeted to an average metropolitan area rental. And although there are some exceptions to that now, in most cases, that amount of the voucher is too low to rent an apartment in a high opportunity place. And it's actually too high to rent in existing segregated neighborhoods because landlords exploit the program.
You know, I'm curious about a couple of things here. You know, I wonder about, I'm glad you addressed that about things like housing prices and you started to hint at other types of schemes like house flipping, for example. I always wonder about, and I'm always curious about, and I want to get your thoughts, Richard, on, you know, the sort of you could call it like the cribification of home ownership, or the HGTVism of home ownership. And, it's just in terms of the American zeitgeist, these very sometimes unrealistic expectations of what a home, whether it's a first-time home or a legacy home, should be or be like. How does that drive these issues we're talking about, like segregation, gentrification? Like, for example, I was talking to a housing expert in central Pennsylvania, in Harrisburg, who was saying, you know what, particularly for some of these more vulnerable populations that are being impacted by these housing disruptions and things like segregation or gentrification, the legacies of redlining, et cetera, we should, and then, we, on top of that, we have to sort of adjust as populations to changes in the environment, to climate change, climate crisis, become more resilient and sustainable. We should look at things like micro housing. Maybe that's something, where the houses are smaller, but they're much more efficient, sustainable. And how could that help? Where communities, populations are becoming greener, maybe resetting expectations about what housing should be. Could that also be a way towards more equitable housing arrangements for communities and populations in metro areas?
Well, metro areas, as I said earlier, vary enormously. There are some that are where property values are rising very rapidly, gentrifying places like New York and like Washington, and others where they're rising much more modestly. So the solutions have to be different in different places.
Right.
But one of the things that's happening in the rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. Workers, teachers, nurses, hotel and restaurant workers, construction workers are being forced farther and farther away from the places in which they work. This is doing enormous damage to the environment. They are driving much more to commute to the places where they work, because they are being forced to live in outlying, frequently more newly segregated neighborhoods. And what's most tragic about this is this process is supported by environmentalists, because what they do, what the environmentalist community does, is frequently require that the homes in which they now occupy in distant suburbs, newly segregated suburbs, that they be more environmentally sensitive, better insulated, smaller and so forth, and no parking, making it more difficult for people to commute. At the same time that they're not counting the additional pollution that's created by forcing these families to commute long distances into cities. So it's not environmentally sensitive to place more environmental regulations on homes for workers who are being forced to move farther and farther away from cities and commute longer distances.
You talk about, if you would, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I'm real curious about that, because one thing we didn't mention was the pandemic, right? Because pandemic is finding middle-class professionals with social mobility now wanting to find open space in the suburbs. So predictably, the people able to move out of cities with more ease are white people. So things seem to be going back into reverse now, right? Like we had white flight in the late 60s, early 70s out into the suburbs, and then white insertion back into the cities in the early 2000s. And now it's like reversing all over again. It seems, I don't know, the data is still, the jury's still kind of out on that, because this is all very recent. And that's happening just at a time when Black populations were moving more into the suburbs, and there was this rise in suburban poverty that we were seeing in places like the suburbs of Washington, D.C., Prince George's County is one example. Affluent, middle-class Black, but by another standard. But tell us how that plays out. Like, I wonder about that now with pandemic inserted into the equation. And this is going to be, the effects of that are going to be for years.
Well, I think you're right. You're also right that it's too early to have real data on this. But my impression is, and this is all we can go by now, is that housing prices in suburban areas are rising rapidly around many of these big urban centers like New York and Washington, because people who used to want to live as gentrifiers who wanted to live near where they were working, now see their futures working from home. And so I expect, but this is, as you say, it's too early to know, but I expect there to be a reversal. I expect rental properties and housing properties in urban areas to begin to fall as demand for housing near central business districts begins to fall, and housing prices in suburban areas to begin to rise as people see their futures as working from home. But I think you're absolutely right about the trends, what the trends are going to be, but we don't have data yet that's long-term to know if that's really going to be.
You know, the other thing here too, Richard, I'm curious, how do we account for people that simply want to live in neighborhoods where there are more people around that look like them? And that's not just that's not just in the case of, say, middle class whites or working class whites. That may be the case for Black populations too. So, you know, you have that sort of that forced segregation that's manifested through a variety of ways and policies, some intentional, some not. But then there's like just the personal decisions and choices of people. So we in an ideal world, we want inclusive, diverse neighborhoods, but sometimes people just want to be around other people that look like them. How do we address that?
This is an easy excuse to fail to address this issue. There are predominantly Jewish communities, there are predominantly Italian communities, there are predominantly Irish communities. Nobody prevents people from living in clusters like that. The only group that's living in a cluster like that because they have been prohibited from living anywhere else is African Americans. And my answer to that claim that you make is, yeah, sure, there are people who want to live with others just like them. Let's open up all the communities and let people have the choice. And there will be some people who will want, some African Americans in particular, who will want to live in predominantly African American neighborhoods, just like there are Jews who want to live in predominantly Jewish neighborhoods and Italians who want to live in predominantly Italian neighborhoods. But they'll have the choice of doing so. They won't be doing so because they have been excluded from and continue to be excluded from other places. You know, we have a lot of evidence for what people will choose to do when they're given the choice. There are a few, as I'm sure you and your members know, there are a few places where we have what are called mobility programs for Section 8 voucher holders, where typically as a result of a court settlement around the historic patterns of segregation, enhanced vouchers are offered to Section 8 voucher eligible families who want to move to predominantly white, more middle-class neighborhoods. The waiting lists for those programs are long. We have throughout the 20th century, hundreds, thousands of cases of African Americans who moved to predominantly white neighborhoods and then were driven out by mob violence. It clearly was not the case that every African American chose to remain in a predominantly African American neighborhood. So let's give people the choice. Let's redress the segregation that we've created with some of the policies that I've described. And then people can choose whether they want to associate only with people or predominantly with people just like them, or whether they want to move to communities where there's more opportunity.
How about, and I'm sure you've been aware of it, you've been watching this very closely. A lot of people have been talking about reparations as a prescription. And that's the first time we've seen in a major presidential election cycle that being raised as a major theme or issue. You had in Asheville, North Carolina, I believe it was, where the city council there proposed and passed some sort of reparations package. It wasn't necessarily like cutting a check to individual Black families in Asheville, North Carolina. It was like an array of different programs. It was more programmatic. Reparations, opportunity zones is something that pops up. Talk about those as potential, but it all, I guess it depends on how you format those or tailor those for the needs and circumstances of those populations.
Well, you're right. The term reparations, I think, is a dangerous one. We certainly need many policies that include, but don't not exclusively, monetary cutting checks, as you say. One of the policies that I described before, subsidizing African Americans to purchase homes in neighborhoods from which they were excluded, will be an expensive policy. But there are many policies that we have to follow. As Asheville knows, despite the fact that they term it reparations, which is largely misunderstood, there are many policies we should follow that are cost-free. Doesn't cost anything to prohibit single-family zoning in exclusively white suburban communities. Doesn't cost anything to place a priority on the placement of low-income housing tax credit projects in higher opportunity places. So we need both expensive policies, like the subsidization of African Americans to move to places from which they've been historically excluded, but which are now unaffordable, but weren't unaffordable in the past. And we need policies that are not costly. The other thing that we have to be careful about with reparations is that it's inconceivable that if we were to enact a reparations program, and even if we could figure out who would be eligible for such reparations, it's inconceivable that the amounts of checks that would be cut would be big enough to solve this problem. But it would have the danger of creating a popular understanding that we've now taken care of it, that we don't need to do anything more, and that we've now redressed 4 centuries of slavery and Jim Crow by cutting very modest checks. So I'm careful about that.
Yeah, have the the various concepts that you come up with, potential policy prescriptions, have more and more of those come out as we've seen like changes on the political landscape. For example, since the inception of the Voting Rights Act, we've seen an explosion of more Black and brown elected officials. We at Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color, representing lots of African American, Latino, indigenous state legislators. We see like that, I guess it's like for Black elected officials alone, it's like 12,000 state, local, and federal level. Is that viewed as, those sort of political power factors? Can they serve as a prevention strategy on some scale? Have they helped with alleviating the impact, the nefarious ways, the sinister ways that segregation plays out when you have, majority Black, say, city councils or more diverse state legislatures? Does that help?
Well, once cities become poor enough to become dysfunctional, once their tax base erodes, then we like to turn those cities over to African American mayors and councilmen to deal with the problems. We don't turn over affluent, high opportunity places too often to African American mayors and council people. So I don't think that's helped. I certainly support the election of people without regard to race, but having an African American mayor doesn't create a tax base in a community that permits it to redress these problems. We know what the policies, I've mentioned a number of them, we know what the policies to redress segregation are. What's missing is not policy ideas, but a new civil rights movement that's going to demand their enactment. That's what's missing. The policy ideas are well known. Presidential candidates in the Democratic primary talked about a lot of them. They talked about down payment assistance programs, for example, similar to something that I was talking about earlier. But there's no political support for it. Even the present Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Ben Carson, who claims to be a libertarian, came out at the beginning of his term against single-family zoning. He's been silent on it since. There's no political support for doing something like that, and I'm not even sure it was a sincere objection that he made initially. But we don't have a new civil rights movement that's going to make it as uncomfortable to maintain residential segregation with an understanding that's unconstitutional as the civil rights movement of the 1960s made it uncomfortable to have segregation of water fountains and swimming pools and lunch counters and buses. That's what we need more than policy ideas. We have the policy ideas.
How do you think this will all play out? You mentioned Secretary Carson over there, Housing and Urban Development. We've had conversation about the elimination of various fair housing rules and the rollback of Obama administration very aggressive anti-segregation policies. I don't think President Obama or anyone in that administration imagined that the rollback of those policies would be as vicious as they've been in just recent years. So we're seeing segregation being used as a political tool, political weapon. How do you think this is going to play out? How rapidly do you see these types of changes taking foot? And even past the election, regardless of who wins, how dangerous is all of that? The kinds of changes, the rapid regulatory rollbacks that we're seeing.
Well, I think that the process should be reversed again, and we should re-implement some of those policies that the Obama administration, but we shouldn't exaggerate how powerful they were. Donald Trump is talking about how the Obama policies are placing low-income housing in affluent suburban neighborhoods. The repeal, really, of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that the Obama administration enacted. That rule, enacted in 2015, has not placed a single unit of low-income housing in any suburb anywhere in the country. All that rule required was for suburbs to analyze the extent to which they were segregated and the causes for it, and come up with long-term plans to address that segregation. And sometime in the indefinable future, the rule said that HUD might withhold community development block grant funds from communities that would redress their segregation. Not a single fund, not a single dollar has been withheld under that rule from any community anywhere. So the rule should be reinstated, but we shouldn't exaggerate the power of that rule to redress the segregation that we've imposed on this country.
I agree with your earlier statement just a couple of minutes ago, Richard, and I know I got you for a couple more minutes, that you probably need a movement around this because you have like a lot of nuance here. It's a very complex topic to unpack, segregation, or how segregation is playing out. So some final thoughts on how do you spark that movement? How do you get more awareness around it? Like, we're in this big Black Lives Matter movement moment right now. We're in a moment where pandemic, protest, and the toxicity in politics are all converging at once. But the way you describe it, that housing issue, that wealth generation gap, is at the central, that lack of economic parity precipitated by that housing segregation, is really kind of at the core of all these struggles of what we're seeing unfolding, of what we're going through. And so how do you spark more awareness around it where people, because it's not the kind of thing that crystallizes in the form of a white cop with his knee on a black man's neck, right? These things they're happening over a long period of years. They're not very visible, but people are feeling its impact. I mean, how do we get more awareness out there about it?
Well, I think we're getting a lot of awareness out of it. It needs to move on from awareness to action. I'm very hopeful. There's more, as I said, there's more accurate and passionate discussion about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow than there ever has been before in American history.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful that an understanding of the unconstitutional fashion in which residential segregation was imposed on this country, not just because of my book, but there are many books now and articles that are written about this. It's becoming much more well known. And that out of that will be a new civil rights movement that will begin to address it. I'm hopeful about that, not confident, but hopeful because of the greater awareness that we now have about this legacy.
We've been talking with New York Times bestselling author Richard Rothstein. He is the author of, and many of you have probably already read it, which is good, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Richard, also the Distinguished Fellow of the Economic Policy Institute. Go to epi.org for more there. Also, he's a fellow of the Thurgood Marshall Institute at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and senior fellow at the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. He's been joining us for our CSG East weekly webinar series on race, racism, and the law. We have another conversation like this tomorrow. I'll talk about that in the moment. Richard, thank you so much for your time and for your insights. I wish we could have had more, because you did say, right, you could go on for hours about this, but I know you're limited in time. This is very, very enlightening, very useful and instructive too. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. And thank you everyone, participants, attendees who've been joining us this afternoon. We have another discussion that's being scheduled for tomorrow. Go to #Movement Summit. You can also find more information on that at csg-erc.org. That will be a discussion. Once again, another discussion continues series on race, racism, and the law with Professors Kalila Brown, Dean of Quinnipiac University, and Christina Greer at Fordham University. We'll be talking about some of the issues in their books. I'm looking forward to that discussion. Same bad time, same bad channel tomorrow as well. So look out for that. Get registered for that too. You can reach me at Ellison Report on twitter.com to get more information on that. Registration is still open. We're continuing that, or once again, #Movement Summit. I'm Charles Ellison. I am normally host, executive producer, and also creator of Reality Check, a daily public affairs program on WURD Radio in Philadelphia, also in DC. Go to wurdradio.com to tune in, and also to youtube.com/onword to watch it on WURD TV. So looking forward to seeing you there. But I'm also senior fellow for the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color, proudly so, and been very pleased and honored to bring you since April the ongoing Equity Gap Micro Summit series. We have more of those. We're going into a new season of that. Looking forward to seeing you all there. So in the meantime, everyone, thank you once again for participating in this discussion. And please, everyone, mask up and wash your hands, and please stay very safe out there. We definitely want to see you tomorrow, and we want to see you for all the micro summits, but we want to make sure everyone is healthy and safe out there through this pandemic. And I'm looking forward to seeing everyone on the other side of it next year in Toronto, Ontario province, actually, for our CSG East conference then. But in the meantime, we'll do everything virtually. It is a pleasure to see everyone here. Everyone have a great afternoon, good evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.